Hey guys, couple of days back I posted this Blender Eevee real-time render piece on the internet, and I really appreciate the amount of feedback and response I got on that video. So in this video we'll be going through the basic layouting of the scenes and all the steps I took to set up all the lighting and the volumetric effects and also the particle effects in the shots. In the end, I'll be also going through a little bit of post-processing I did on the shots to bring out more detail in them. So yeah, without further ado, let's dive in. So once you have your account set up, you can install Quixel Bridge and also the Blender plugins so that you can quickly export Megascan assets and test them inside Blender and see which ones are working for you. I'll link some videos in the description below so that you can follow and install all the necessary components. So I used Limestone Curie assets pack in my demo. Apparently they are the same one used in the PS5 demo, I'm not too sure. I'm gonna go inside them, then I'm gonna choose, I've already added the ones I used to my favorite list. So if you just click on that, I used 8K textures on all the assets and level of detail 0, which gives you a very high triangle count. So we're gonna select that, hit export, and same for this guy. And I also use this one and this little guy too. Now as you can see, I have all my assets inside the Blender scene file, and I'll switch to the look dev mode to see some textures on them. There you go. Let's also separate them and see what's going on. That, it's like that, and maybe also rotate them. I used Physical Starlight and Atmosphere add-on to light up my scene. If I go to the add-on page, so big shout out to the creator Rick for coming up with this add-on. I think it's an incredible tool for daylight lighting. I've used other add-ons in combination of HDRs in the past, but it's very hard to customize those setups and get the result you want. This works quite similar to the Octane skylight system. And what this essentially does is simulate a true skylight system in Blender by taking atmosphere density and height into consideration, and thus gives a very realistic light fall off and shadows for your objects. Basically it surrounds your scene with a very high dynamic range sky, and you can manipulate that sky using the given parameters in the add-on. But also in this video I'll show you an alternate way of lighting the scene with just using a regular sunlight and any HDR. If I activate that add-on in my Blender scene over here, physical atmosphere, if I turn that on and then go to viewport shading. Alright, so once that is on, you can see it surrounds our scene with this very high dynamic range sky and gives you these parameters to tweak the sky. So the first one is called azimuth. It's basically the horizontal direction of the sun, and then we have elevation, which is the vertical distance, and then you also have angular diameter, which increases the size of the sun, and then you have temperature. You can make the scene warmer or make it look a little bit cooler. We also have intensity, which you can add on top when you change the elevation. If you want more intensity, you can just increase this, and then you will have a stronger light affecting your objects. In the atmosphere settings, we have the density. If you change this, it increases the turbidity in the atmosphere, and that also makes it a bit hazy, and in turn it also affects the light temperature. So I'm gonna go ahead and start the layout of the shots and use the lighting as a guide as how I want the shot to shape up, and see how the light is behaving inside the cave. So I don't want you to sit through the whole thing, and I'll just fast forward this section. So the idea behind this piece is telling a story through this lion sculpture, which represents a king which once ruled over the jungle but now is on the verge of extinction. So I wanted to put this lion sculpture in an enclosed space with a very strong volume light coming in through the gap and falling on the sculpture. I'm also creating these planes so that I can block the extra light coming in from the beneath and the top. So for the first shot, I created a camera with a very wide focal length so I can capture the environment as much as possible. I'm also using 2.35 aspect ratio for this shot. Actually, for the whole piece I use 2.35 aspect ratio. As you can see, I'm also tweaking the light direction and intensity as I'm doing the layout and just trying to find the right balance between the lights and the shadows. I'm also scaling the rocks and rotating them to give more variation to the structures and just to make sure that they don't look the same. Alright, so we are done with the layout. I'm quite happy the way it turned out. Really like this light hitting this wall on this side, and the amount of shadows the light is creating inside the cave. But if you see on the screen left side, we have this white speck appearing on our rock structures. So the reason for that could be because some of these structures are hollow from the other side. A light of that intensity, when hits the object, it might be messing up with the normals and Eevee is not able to calculate it properly. So to fix that, I'm just going to create some planes to cut the light on the other side. So just create a plane, rotate it, and I'm just going to move it behind this rock structure. I'm just going to scale that. So as I put the plane, you can see we are removing the white speck. There you go. I'm just gonna create one for the bottom piece as well. There you go, much better. So I sourced the lion asset from myminifactory.com, which hosts a bunch of free and paid 3D assets. Some of them are very high detail 3D scans from actual sculptures around the world, and those are very detailed. The one I used in my project is called Recumbent Lion, which is an actual sculpture at I don't know if I can pronounce it, Thorvaldsen Museum and in Copenhagen. So you can go ahead and download the asset, and it comes in .stl format, which Blender supports natively, so you don't have to do any conversions, which is good. Also, you can support the publisher if you want to by clicking on this button. So let's import the line asset in our shot. Alright, so I'll go to File, Import, STL, and let's go to Assets, line.stl. Just gonna import that. It's gonna take some time. Alright, so sorry, I have it in my scene now, and yeah, so the model is pretty detailed from the get-go. So I'll scale it down, of course. So let's just set the origin to the center of the geometry and scale it down, and let's put it over this piece of rock. I'm just gonna eyeball the scale over here. Alright, so let's start putting some textures on our sculpture. So to texture this, I used a stone texture I found on the internet. It's made up of color, texture, normals, and roughness map. So I'm just gonna bring them into Blender. So let's just create a principal shader by hitting this new tab. Alright, and I'm just gonna drag it inside the node editor, the normals and the roughness. So let's just connect the color output to the base color input of the principal BSDF, and let's do the same for normals. So I'm just gonna use a normal map node. Connect the color to the color and normals to the normals. Just make sure everything is non-color in the color space. There you go. So you can see right off the bat, I'm getting these nice cracks and damages to the sculpture, And let's also plug in the roughness to the roughness input. It's a little bit shiny, so I'm just going to reduce the specular on our shader. I feel it's a little bit too white, so I'm just going to color it closer to its environment. So let's just put a color ramp node after our colored image texture and change the color somewhere around that. Let's reduce the value a little bit. Maybe actually just pick the rock colors over here. Maybe it's too dark. Still looks a little bit too shiny, so let's just reduce the spec a little bit more. You should have just like a little bit of spec, not too much. Alright, so now I'm gonna tweak some things in the Eevee render settings. So the very first thing I'm gonna turn on is we need some ambient occlusion in our scene. So let's turn on ambient occlusion, and you can see we are getting some nice depth in the crevices. So I'm just gonna play around with this setting, so have a little bit more. So yeah, it is making a huge difference in our shot and actually giving it a little bit more depth, which is good. The other thing I want to tweak is some of these rocks actually have a little bit speck into it, so I just want to reduce them. So let's just reduce that a little bit too. Let's go into the materials of these rocks. Reduce for that. Turn down for that one as well. Alright, to make the scene a little bit more interesting, I'm gonna add some volume light into it. So let's just create a cube. And scale it up. Put it where you want the volume to be placed. Let's make it actually a little bit bigger. And let's add a principal volume shader to it. And reduce the density to something like 0.04, and make sure it's connected to the volume of the material output node. So we have some volume now. Let's actually make it a little bit more big. I think the density is a little bit too much, so let's just reduce it even further to 0.002 or maybe 0.15. Just have a little bit of a little hint of the volume light. I think that is looking good. Another thing I'm gonna do is actually try to break up this light patch a little bit and create some interesting patterns over here, and also have some nice streaks of light in our volume object. So for that I'm gonna use a 3D tree model, and I'm just gonna place it outside over here, so that when the light hits the tree, it creates some nice shadows and patterns inside the cave. So let's just bring in our tree asset. So I'll just go import alembic, and let's go to assets, tree. It's gonna bring that in. It's a very simple tree 3D model which I got from BlendSwap. So I'm just gonna scale it down and actually just try and position it so that I create some nice interesting patterns, or you can call it shadows inside the cave. So as you can see, it's actually really helping us to break up this light patch inside the cave, and it's also creating some light streaks in our volume. So let's scale that down a little bit, something like that, and yep, that looks nice. So before I move forward and start creating some floating particles in our scene, I'll take a moment to actually explain what happens when I move the light around, and it seems like there is some real-time GI calculation happening, which is not the case. Eevee is not yet capable of calculating real-time GI. So what happens is, as you know, our scene is surrounded by this high dynamic sky. So when I change the elevation in the atmosphere add-on, it changes the sky brightness. That actually in turn affects the brightness of the shot overall, and it seems like the GI is being calculated real time, but that's not the case. Another way to light this scene is actually just using a regular sunlight and HDR. So if we turn off our atmosphere add-on, you can see now everything has gone dark. We don't have any light source in our scene. And if you create a regular sun and rotate it around the same angle and increase the intensity to something like 30, we still get that nice bright patch on the wall and the volume effects. And to fake the inside illumination, you can just use an HDR, which you can find on the internet. So I'm using the gaffer tool to cycle through all my HDR collection, so you can just see which one is working for you. But the only difference would be that if you rotate the light, the inside illumination won't get affected. So yeah, this is just another way to light the scene if you don't want to use the atmosphere add-on. Alright, so next I'll be creating some floating particles in our volume object. So I'm just gonna use the volume light cube I have over here, or actually rename that to volume light, and I'll just duplicate that in the same place. So let's go ahead and I'll turn off the selection for volume light so that I don't accidentally select that one, and let's call this floating particles. And let's go ahead and create a icosphere, which will be our particles. Let's make it a little smaller. We'll select the floating particles object and go ahead and add a particle system to the object, and I'll go into first I'll go into the render as and change that to object and pick the icosphere as our object. Alright, now to fill the entire volume with our particle, we'll go to render. Actually, we'll go to source and then change the emit from to volume. And I don't want the particles to be emitting. I just want them to just stay at one frame. So I'll just set that to 1. So now I have some particles, and I'll turn up the lifetime as well, so something like 250. Now if you play, you can see all of the particles are actually falling down. So I need to turn off my gravity, so we'll go into field weights and just turn down the gravity all the way through, and now they stay where they are, but they just start moving slowly outwards. So for that I need to turn off the velocity as well. So if you go into the velocity tab and turn down the normal speed, so now they have no movement in them. Perfect. Now I'll go ahead and add a force field to it. So just selecting the floating particles object, you go to object, actually you go to add force field turbulence, and go into the turbulence settings, or field settings, and turn up the strength to something like 0.5 and make sure this global is checked. Now if you play, you can see our particles moving ever so slightly. Alright, looks good. I think the number of particles is a little bit too high, so I'll go into floating particles object and let's just turn it down to around 200. Also, all of them look the same size, so let's go to our floating particles object and turn on the scale randomness. Also, they are a little too bright, so I'll go to the icosphere object, assign a new principal shader, and just turn down the value like that. And that's how you add floating particles to the scene. Alright, it's time to animate the camera. So select the camera. This is just gonna be a slight push in. Press Shift S, set a keyframe on the location parameter, go to the very last frame and just move the camera a little bit forward like that, and press Shift S again, set another key at location, just like that. Now to render the shot, there's not much to the render settings. It's just that I'm using PNG sequences for the final thing, and I think the newer version, which is 2.83, supports Eevee passes. So maybe in future I'll try and render some passes for the shot and try to composite them properly in Nuke. So I'm gonna go ahead and render the shot, and then we'll jump to Nuke and see what kind of post-processing I did to the shot to enhance the details a little bit more. So I'll be back when the render is done. So we are in Nuke now, which is the industry standard software for compositing. This is a non-commercial version of Nuke which you can download and use for free for your personal projects. So in the node graph, I'm gonna hit R and I'll select the sequence which I just rendered, say open, and this is our render. So the very first thing I'll do is actually reduce the reds a little bit in this shot. So let's just hit tab, type in grade to bring in a grade node, and in the gain slider, if you click on this color wheel, you split the color into individual channels. So I'll reduce the red over here a little bit in the whites of the shot, like that, and then hit tab again, and I will introduce some more contrast into the shot. So let's just put a color correct node, and I will increase the contrast a little bit in this shot to have a little bit deeper shadows and increased highlights. Another thing I will do is add a subtle vignette to the shot. So for that, I'll create a grade node again, and then create a roto node and click on the Bezier tools. I'll select B spline and just draw a roto around our frame like that. So if you select the roto, hit 1, you can actually see the shape it's creating. So we need to blur this out a little bit. So I'll hit tab, create a blur node, and let's just set that blur to something like 100. Now we want to grade down the black area, not the white area. So I'll put an invert node just to invert the mask, so the grade is only happening in the white area. And let's just connect the mask input of the grade node to our mask, and if you click on that and hit R 2 times, and then you can just gain it down on the corners over here like that, just a little bit. Maybe I'll adjust the roto a little bit over here. So this just brings a little bit more focus to the center of the frame where the sculpture is. So now to have a little bit more detail in this rocks, what I'll do is actually I'll sharpen the whole frame. So to sharpen, if you put a regular sharpen node and just increase the sharpness like that, you'll start getting these black artifacts which we don't want. So the way I do it is actually convert the whole shot into a different color space, and then do the sharpen node, and then revert back to the correct color space. So for that, I'll put let's delete that, and I'll put a color space node, and in the color space node you set the out to YCBCR. So now we are changing the color space of the shot to YCBCR, and now you put a sharpen node and just put amount, just put 2 in the amount, and I'll copy the color space node, put after the sharpen node, and just click on this swap in and out, which will revert back to our original color space. And now you can see if I turn off and on all these nodes, I'm sharpening the footage, but also preserving details and not introducing any black artifacts. So I think this is a bit too much over here, so I'll just reduce that to 1. Now that is actually bringing a little bit more detail in the rocks. So that is that. The next thing, I will have a little bit of chromatic aberration, which is just another lens effect. So let's put a transform mask node, and I'll split the channels over here which I'll be transforming. So if you click on all and then go to RGB, and you want to move everything except the red, so you uncheck red, and I'll just move green and blue in the X a little bit. So that way I'm introducing a little bit of chromatic aberration, which is just helping sell the shot a little bit more. There's that, and moving on, I'll add a little bit of glow. So for glow, I'm using this gizmo called FXT glow, which gives a very nice exponential glow on the highlights. So if you connect that, so you can see it's giving this nice glow. So I'll just reduce that a little bit. Actually, it's too much right now. I just want a little bit. I think our aberration is a little bit too much as well. So let's just reduce that to 0.5. That looks nice. And I'll finish off by adding a little bit of grain. So to add grain, I'm going to use a dither node, just as lets you add a monochromatic grain. So I'll just check mono dither, and I'll reduce that a little bit, just like that, just ever so slightly. So this is our final shot. I really feel Eevee is a very powerful tool for art directing a shot by tweaking the lights, textures, and just getting instant feedback. In the Unreal demo, the technology they have shown is truly groundbreaking, and I feel Eevee still has a long way to go, but I think it's on the right track. This demo was just to show what you can achieve with Eevee, and I have no intention of comparing it with UE5. I feel both are very different softwares at core. So yeah, thanks for staying with me and watching this video. Let me know if you liked it in the comments, and please consider subscribing to the channel for more tutorials and videos. Thank you.